A new shadow of war is spreading across Europe, but this time it doesn't begin with tanks. It begins with the silence of a ghost. In the Baltic Sea, a pirate war is being fought in the shadows. Russian drones, launched from civilian ships, are spying on NATO bases, while warships sail with their trackers turned off. For NATO, this was the last straw. Russia played a dangerous game, and now it's going to pay the price. Since the beginning of September, NATO intelligence began tracking unusual movements of Russian civilian oil tankers sailing between Kaliningrad, Gdansk, and Gothenburg. At first glance, they looked like routine commercial routes, but satellite images revealed something disturbing. Improvised metal structures on their decks, disguised as cranes and antennas. But in reality, they were launch platforms for mini reconnaissance drones. These were modified versions of the Orlan 10 and Shahed 136 models, adapted for maritime espionage missions. These ghost ships crossed the Baltic Sea transmitting normal civilian traffic signals, while their satellite communication systems operated in encrypted silence. At specific times, their AIS transponders were turned off for a few minutes, just enough time to launch the drones and retrieve telemetry. Their targets were clearly defined: NATO bases in Poland and Sweden. The drones flew over the runways of the Lask Air Base and the military port of Karlskrona, where Swedish ships were conducting joint exercises with American forces. The pattern was identical in every mission: short flights, low altitude, and precise collection of radar and defense communication signals. It was pure espionage, but with a hybrid signature: no flag, no trace, and no accountability. In the following days, the provocations escalated. Between September 24th and 26th, 4 Danish airports were forced to suspend flights after unidentified drones were detected in their airspace. None were shot down, and no government claimed responsibility. The message was clear: Moscow wanted to show it could interfere deep inside Europe, disrupting both civilian and military infrastructure at the same time. For many analysts, this was the new face of Russian warfare, a pirate war fought in the shadows of maritime traffic and the loopholes of international law. But the episode that turned an alert into a full-blown crisis happened on September 28th. The Russian warship Alexander Shabalin was detected just 25 kilometers from the Great Belt Bridge, one of Denmark's main maritime routes. So far, nothing unusual. The problem was that the Shabalin was sailing with its transponder turned off, completely invisible to civilian tracking systems. To radar operators, it was as if an entire destroyer had appeared out of nowhere in one of Europe's most closely monitored waters. The Danish Navy went on full alert. Satellites and coastal sensors picked up radio emissions and metallic echoes near the vessel, raising suspicions that the ship might be operating drones from its own platform. The mere possibility of a UAV launch at such close range, within one of Europe's busiest sea corridors, set off alarms in Copenhagen, Brussels, and Washington. Putin's invisible war had just crossed the red line. NATO had been enduring Russian provocations for months, but the incident with the Alexander Shabalin was the final straw. A Russian warship sailing without a transponder inside a civilian route of Denmark was interpreted for what it really was: a deliberate act of intimidation. For the first time since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the alliance acknowledged that the Baltic had become a new front. Russia wasn't just spying, it was testing how far it could go without firing a single shot. In Brussels, diplomatic channels were shut down. The tone of communication between NATO generals and the Pentagon shifted within hours. And that's when the United States, as the founding member and main force of the alliance, decided to respond. The order came directly from the US European Command. The USS Gerald R. the largest, most advanced, and most powerful aircraft carrier ever built, would leave its position in the Arctic and sail toward the Baltic Sea. The Ford isn't just a ship, it's a floating city of war. Over 100,000 tons of steel, powered by 2 nuclear reactors capable of generating enough energy to supply a city of 100,000 people. Its flight deck hosts more than 70 aircraft, including FA-18E Super Hornets, 5th generation F-35C Lightning IIs, and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. All of it coordinated by an integrated digital system where every radar, sensor, and missile shares information in real time. It is the physical embodiment of America's concept of maritime supremacy: see first, decide first, strike first. The Gerald R. Ford had already been participating in Exercise Neptune Strike. a maneuver in the Arctic focused on naval route defense and missile interception simulations. But after the Danish crisis, its mission was abruptly redefined. The exercise turned into a real operation. The carrier received a new directive, Pirate Hunt, the codename NATO used to refer to Russian vessels suspected of operating drones and clandestine equipment in European waters. In less than 48 hours, the Ford left the Arctic Circle and crossed the Skagerrak Strait, accompanied by a full strike group, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a Ticonderoga-class air defense cruiser, and a Virginia-class attack submarine. It was a force capable of dominating the sea, the air, and the space around it, with long-range sensors and missiles able to hit targets over 1,000 kilometers away. No other country on Earth can mobilize that kind of power in such a short time. For many analysts, the American response was disproportionate, a nuclear supercarrier against disguised Russian civilian ships. But that was exactly the point. If Moscow wanted to play a shadow war, Washington would show what happens when the lights are turned on. The Pirate Hunt wasn't just a military operation, it was a calculated display of power, a way of saying that Russian bullying had limits. And this time, that limit was being patrolled by supersonic jets and an American flight deck the size of 4 football fields. When the USS Gerald R. Ford crossed the strait and officially entered the Baltic Sea, the message to Moscow was clear. NATO is not just a defensive alliance, it is a force capable of projecting power and striking back if provoked. The carrier's very movement was, by itself, a declaration of political warfare. Russia had spent months provoking with drones and acts of sabotage. Now, it faced a machine designed to destroy targets thousands of kilometers away, without warning and without error. The message was unmistakable. If Putin's hybrid war crossed the line, the United States was ready to take the fight directly to Russia's most sensitive military assets. The Gerald R. Ford is a mobile airbase with full strike capability. With the capacity to launch up to 160 combat sorties per day, the ship alone can establish air superiority over the entire northern region of Europe and the Baltic Sea. Its F-35C Lightning IIs, equipped with AESA radars and next-generation electronic warfare systems, can detect and eliminate targets long before they are seen. On board, the electromagnetic catapult system, EMALS, replaces the old steam launchers, allowing faster, quieter, and more precise launches. It's a technological leap that gives the Americans a rate of attack no one else can match. No regional air force, not even the combined fleet of Russian Su-35s and MiG-31s, could secure control of the skies against a carrier air wing of that scale. With the Gerald R. Ford positioned between Norway and Denmark, Russia's entire northern fleet, based in Murmansk and Severomorsk, fell within direct range of American fighters. From its deck, the carrier could launch missions over the logistical heart of Russian operations, including Kaliningrad, where Moscow keeps its S-400 air defense systems and medium-range Iskander missiles. For Russia, it was like watching the chessboard being flipped upside down. The airspace that once felt like a fortress had become vulnerable, monitored, and tracked by Western sensors 24 hours a day. Farther north, the threat became even more critical. The Kola Peninsula, home to Russia's Bory-class strategic submarines and the ballistic missiles that sustain its nuclear deterrent, had entered the F-35C's operational range. That meant NATO could neutralize the core of Russia's nuclear power within minutes. It was both a symbolic and psychological blow. Moscow, long accustomed to projecting fear, was now the one feeling it closing in. While radars and aircraft dominated the skies, a second war was unfolding beneath the surface. NATO attack submarines, including Virginia and Astute-class units, began sweeping the Baltic seabed for Russian contacts. Every sound, every acoustic signature was analyzed by sonar systems capable of identifying a propeller's pattern from more than 500 kilometers away. It was an underwater chess match where the first mistake could cost billions and trigger a war no one could control. The US air power wasn't alone in this hunt. NATO P-8, Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft, equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors and Mk-54 torpedoes, flew overlapping routes above the area, forming an impenetrable surveillance web. At the slightest hint of Russian underwater activity, coordinates were relayed directly to the Gerald R. Ford strike group. With each passing hour, the edges of the Baltic Sea grew denser with radars, sonars, and encrypted transmissions. The invisible war, fought in the waves and in the depths, had begun. What started as a symbolic response to Russia's pirate war had now evolved into something far greater, an unprecedented show of force in northern Europe. And for Putin, the signal was impossible to ignore. The largest warship on the planet was literally at his doorstep, carrying with it a single undeniable truth. The balance of power had changed. The advance of the USS Gerald R didn't just shift the military balance in northern Europe, it cemented a new geopolitical reality. Today, the Baltic Sea is practically a NATO lake. With Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, the entire perimeter of the Baltic, from Oslo to Tallinn, is now surrounded by member states. What was once a vulnerable corridor for Russian forces has become a ring of constant surveillance, monitored by Allied radars, aircraft and submarines. The accession of Helsinki and Stockholm didn't just close the map, it shattered decades of Russian strategy. The Kremlin had dreamed of dominating the Baltic, turning it into a natural extension of its sphere of influence. A backyard, shielded by Kaliningrad and the Northern Fleet. That dream is over. Now, every cubic meter of water is watched, every movement tracked, and every Russian ship leaving port is immediately tagged as a potential target. For Putin, this marks the greatest geostrategic defeat since the end of the Cold War. The sea he once believed he controlled is now dominated by America's allies, and the naval routes that sustained Russia's trade are under constant threat. NATO doesn't need to fire a single shot to choke Moscow's economy. It only has to close the Baltic, and the flow of energy, fertilizer, and minerals will be strangled. What was once Russia's pride, its ability to project naval power and influence over its European neighbors, has turned into a trap. Inside the Kremlin, the dilemma is clear. To retreat would mean admitting weakness and public humiliation. To advance would mean risking an escalation the country cannot sustain. Every naval movement is now closely tracked by American satellites and NATO early warning aircraft. Any mistake, any aggressive gesture, could lead to the total destruction of a Russian ship, and with it, the collapse of Putin's prestige. That's why the pirate tactics emerged, because Moscow no longer has the strength for a direct confrontation. Launching drones from civilian ships, using sabotage and disinformation, that's all that remains for a cornered regime trying to look strong while falling apart from within. These actions don't come from confidence, they come from desperation. Russia is trapped between sanctions that suffocate its economy and a military stalemate in Ukraine that drains its resources and morale. Its arsenal is aging, its shipyards can't replace the losses, and the ruble is collapsing under the weight of war. The provocations in the Baltic are just the reflection of an empire in decay, trying to keep up appearances through reckless gestures. Putin knows he can't win militarily, so he's trying to win narratively, to convince his people that he's still in control, even if he has to rely on deception and stage-managed operations. But the real game he's playing now is the most dangerous and the bloodiest, the internal one. Facing failure in Ukraine and NATO's tightening encirclement, Putin's regime has begun to hunt for scapegoats. Generals are replaced, ministers investigated, and oligarchs meet mysterious accidents. The system he built on fear is now feeding on that same fear. The president, who once used external threats to keep the nation united, now faces a quieter enemy: the loss of faith within the Kremlin itself. While the USS Gerald R. Ford patrols the Baltic and American jets rule the skies, Russia is fighting a different war, a war of nerves, waged inside the corridors of power. Putin no longer fears NATO. He fears the collapse of the myth that sustained him for more than 2 decades. Because when fear changes direction and starts living inside the palace, no arsenal on Earth is enough to stop it. NATO has shown that its words are not empty. Led by the United States, its ships and aircraft have turned the Baltic Sea into a symbol of deterrence and sent Moscow a message impossible to ignore. The era of unpunished provocations is over. American power now sails literally at Putin's doorstep, and every Russian move will be watched, with a finger on the trigger. But the question that remains is, what will Putin do next? Retreat or challenge the world once again? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share what you think is coming next. And if you want to understand why even the Kremlin itself knows the end is near, watch our next video. By 2026, Russia will lose everything. Even Putin knows it's over.